All right, I'm already back. Okay, so just glancing at those first 4 slides, I see there's one point that I wanted to mention that I forgot. And it has to do with upregulation or downregulation of receptors. We'd said hormones go out and they affect certain cells. Now, we have 2 different categories. I'm not leaving this subject, but I'm adding another bit of information before I continue with my story. We have 2 major categories of hormones. We have steroid hormones and non-steroid hormones. If I mention steroids, just in common literature, in the news, sports, you might think of something, right? If I mention, with regards to sports, if I mention steroids, you say, oh yeah, I've heard of that. Anabolic steroids abuse by sportsmen? Yeah, you've heard of it. Well, it ends up, and so what is anabolic means it's it's building, right? Catabolism and versus anabolism. So it's a building. And it ends up, there are certain kinds of hormones that cause you to get stronger. Testosterone, the male sex hormone, it's a steroid, and one of its influences is to create muscle mass. And so people, sports people have figured out, if I inject myself with excess testosterone, I can get bigger muscles. But now, I'd said here in the 3rd slide, I mentioned something about upregulation and downregulation of receptors. There was a famous baseball player who looked more like a football player. Jose Canseco is the one that I'm talking about, but he was very big, right? Well, he was big because he was abusing steroids, anabolic steroid hormones. Well, it ends up after his career, he lived, he was a big-time baseball player maybe 20 or 30 years ago. But after his career, he was arrested coming across the border from Mexico with testosterone. Now, why way after his career, way after his baseball career, he was still injecting testosterone? And the reason for that is what I just mentioned, upregulation or downregulation of the receptor. Well, I'd said your body is pretty good at being efficient in this whole process. And so if you have 100 times as much testosterone in circulation, or 1,000 times as much as is normal, your body says, I don't need all these extra receptors. I'm just going to downregulate my receptors. And so this ends up being what can happen. And it ended up that it basically ruined his life because he can't function normally as a guy, you get my picture here, without injecting himself with steroids because his body downregulated the receptor because he had abused it so much. So it's one of the downsides. It's a pretty big downside if you're a guy. All right. Steroids. I've been 4 minutes talking. So, so steroids. We said we have 2 major categories of hormones. Now, you might remember from earlier this semester, we had talked about how lipids, there was a group of lipids that we called steroids, and they consist of this sort of ring structure, and they consisted of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen only, and they had a ring structure, and so they're categorized as a lipid. It ends up, we had said some hormones, like that testosterone, are chemically lipids. And we had said, okay, All right, so some of them are these sort of strange looking molecules with these ring structures. And we had said, what does a hormone do? It changes physiology. So how? How do we change physiology? Well, it ends up that steroid, it can pass right through the cell membrane. So it kind of scooches through the cell membrane and it goes into the cell, and it doesn't stop there. It keeps on going. Where does it go? It goes into the nucleus, scooches in there, and then what does it do? What does it do? What did we say hormones do? They change physiology. So if you're going to change physiology, you're going to be turning a gene on, right? It changes gene expression. So with the steroid hormones, what happens is you have this hormone, it goes into the nucleus of the cell, of the target cell, and it will combine with what we call a promoter in there, and that causes a gene to be expressed. And so we had said, with all hormones, we're going to change physiology. Well, that changes physiology. So with these steroids, this big category of hormones called steroids, it's not just testosterone, there's a bunch of them, but the ones that are hormones that consist of this ring structure, they have their effect in the nucleus of the cell. And what do? They change gene expression. Okay, so we said we have two categories of hormones, steroids and non-steroids. I mean, they could have really even phrased these differently. They named them that way, but it could have been proteins or non-proteins, because the ones that are non-steroid are either proteins or peptides or modified amino acids. So there's two categories, the ones that are lipids and the ones that are proteins, but we call those non-steroids. But before I get to that, when it comes to building a steroid hormone, and we had said it's this weird chemical structure. And oh, by the way, you can see a picture of what I'm talking about on slide number 6. So slide number 5 is showing the steroid hormone going in and turning on a gene. But on slide number 6, you'll see a picture of something called pregnenolone. Yeah. Everyone, we say that all the time, don't we? Pregnenolone. Not so much. But all of these steroid hormones start out as cholesterol, and then they get modified into pregnenolone, and then they become their final form. Testosterone, cortisol, all of these things that are the steroid hormones. They go through a series of steps as they're being made, cholesterol to pregnenolone to the final hormone. Okay, we're 8 minutes, 9 minutes. All right, the other kind of hormone, we had said we have two categories, steroid and non-steroid, and we said you could honestly have called them protein hormones or non-protein hormones, but we don't. So the non-steroid hormones are proteins or modified proteins or modified amino acids. Now, what do we know about proteins? They're not going through the cell membrane. We know that for sure, right? If you've been paying attention at all, you know that. So they have a different mode of action, because we said what? What did we say? We said all hormones change physiology. So if we look at slide number 7, we see a receptor on the cell membrane. And it's like you say, oh, what is all of that stuff there? Well, you see a big triangle at the top, and then something going back and forth through the cell membrane. That is the receptor. And it ends up that receptor has an extracellular domain, the part, a intracellular domain, that's the inside part of, that receptor, and then the part that's right there in the middle of the cell membrane, holding it in place. So when we look at this picture here, you can see the hormone is bound on the outside. We said it's a protein. It can't go through the cell membrane. But by binding on the extracellular domain on the outside, what does it do? It changes the inside. It changes the intracellular domain. How does it change it? It converts it into an enzyme. And that enzyme causes something to happen, right? And so what it does is it produces what we call a second messenger. And so through a series of steps involving protein G, we end up making cyclic AMP, adenosine monophosphate, but it's cyclic AMP. Well, it ends up, what does this cyclic AMP do? It's on the inside of the cell. What does it do? It goes into the nucleus. It's just like that steroid hormone, except that this is the second messenger. It goes into the nucleus, turns on a gene, changes physiology, just like the steroid hormones. So one final point before I stop right here. So on slide number 8, we have some pictures of actual receptors, and there's a growth factor, and I can't read my writing here, but I think it may be an insulin, I'm not sure. But when you look at it, you see the extracellular domain, that's where the hormone combines. The intracellular domain, that's where we produce the G protein, and which ultimately produces the second messenger. And then we have the transmembrane domain. And what this is a hydrophobic, nonpolar portion of the receptor. And what's on the inside of that cell membrane? It's that hydrophobic nonpolar region. And this is how the receptor is held in the cell membrane, is because of that transmembrane domain. All right, I've gone 13 minutes, better stop right here.